The Milwaukee Bucks have a huge problem. Yes, they have one of the better records in the league. They're an awesome home team. They're an amazing offensive team. And if you just looked at all that stuff, you might assume that they are a true top-tier contender. But amongst the top teams in the league, the teams that have the best record right now, Milwaukee has the most glaring flaw of any of the teams that consider themselves contenders right now. And there's really no better way to put this. They can't guard. As it stands right now, the Bucks are in the bottom 10 in defensive rating across the entire league, which is a massive change from where they've been the last few seasons. They've always been in the top half of the league before, even at their worst under the old coaching staff, and oftentimes they were top 10 or top 5. This was the calling card for Milwaukee these last few seasons, was that they were a balanced team. They were always near or in the top 5, both offensive and defensive rating, and they had all defensive caliber players and defensive player of the year caliber players like Jrue Holiday, Giannis, Brook Lopez. But this version of the Bucks, with all the changes that they've made this offseason, is completely different. You could certainly argue that they're not necessarily worse, but they're definitely different. But right now, if they can't get their defense figured out, even with as good as their record is, I don't think it's crazy to say that they're not a top tier contender. Now, obviously, there are two big differences between this year's Bucks team and the last couple of years that we've seen them be one of the better defensive teams in the league, one of the better two-way teams in the league. First, no more Jrue Holiday. They make the Damian Lillard trade, and of course, a new coaching staff as well, with Adrian Griffin now in place of Mike Budenholzer. And the results so far defensively this year have just not been good. Now, to be clear, offensively, this is a better team during the regular season, at least so far, than a couple of the versions of the Mike Budenholzer Bucks. Offensively, Damian Lillard, Chris Middleton, Giannis, and spacing is about as devastating of an attack as any team has in the entire league, especially as Chris Middleton is starting to kind of round into form recently. And from a statistical production standpoint, there is no arguing that they have been one of the best offensive teams in the entire league to begin this season, but I'm going to make some arguments against that a little bit later. But let's talk about the defense. There are two main issues here for Milwaukee. First and foremost, they do not have the personnel to be a good defensive team. Obviously, they got rid of Jrue Holiday. Everybody knew at the time that they made the Damian Lillard trade that they were going to be a worse team on the defensive end of the floor. The whole point of the trade was to make them a more dynamic offense because Holiday, especially from a spacing perspective, had fallen off a little bit, especially in the postseason for them. And everybody knew that there was going to be a trade-off in terms of defense to offense. But the problem for Milwaukee has been that Jrue Holiday covered up a lot of the personnel issues that they had defensively on the perimeter because they don't have a wing defender. They don't have a perimeter defender, and primarily that's where they've had their issues defensively, is their perimeter guys cannot guard at all, which is especially concerning in a conference in which you're going to have to be dealing with the Tyrese Maxey, the Jason Tatums of the world to get through the postseason. And when you're waiting around for someone like Jay Crowder to come back and save your defense and be the best perimeter defender on the team, that's not a very good situation to be in. Now, to be fair, over the prior few seasons, Milwaukee's defensive personnel on the perimeter wasn't fantastic either. They had PJ Tucker the year that they won the title. They've had a couple of other guys cycle in and out, but Jrue Holiday covered up a lot of those mistakes, as did, of course, Giannis and Brook Lopez on the back end. But having that one elite perimeter defender in Jrue Holiday allowed them to try and take away the other team's best player, and without him in place, Giannis and Lopez are much less effective at the rim. And the stats back this up. Under the Mike Budenholzer era, they were generally speaking a really good team in terms of points in the paint. And this year, they're one of the worst teams in the league in terms of giving up points at the rim. At times, it was frustrating when those Coach Bud teams would give up so many open threes, but it did at least prevent some of those easy points inside. And that's something that certainly from a personnel issue, Milwaukee is having a lot of issues with. And then, of course, there is the new coaching staff part of all this. Adrian Griffin, especially in the beginning of the year, came in with a completely different mindset defensively, where they were much more aggressive, and has backed off on a lot of that stuff recently, but the defense is still a massive issue for this team. And at this point, I'm willing to be in wait and see mode on the coaching staff part of this for Milwaukee. I haven't been impressed, but it's a new team, it's a new roster, it's going to take some time to adjust to some new schemes. By far, the biggest concern for me right now is the personnel defensively. And what them being so bad defensively has meant means that their offense has to be elite on a night-to-night basis. They can't afford to have a bad offensive night, and that means that they're relying more on Giannis this year than they ever have before. They're doing a lot of the stuff that typically they would save for the postseason offensively where they didn't want to play Giannis a ton of minutes. They didn't want him to have this crazy high usage. They didn't want him to have to run into 8 guys every time he tried to get to the rim and get fouled. They're doing that stuff now during the regular season when they used to save it for the postseason because their defense is so bad. And that's the concerning thing for me, is in the past, Milwaukee was always a good regular season team that had a higher ceiling in the postseason because Giannis would play more minutes, because they would play him at the 5 more. They always had extra stuff up their sleeves in the postseason, especially offensively, yet still managed to be a really good regular season team. And right now, Milwaukee, especially offensively, is a really good regular season team. And certainly from a record standpoint, it's hard to argue with where they are in the standings right now. But if I was a Bucks fan, I would be concerned that because of how bad their defense is, they're having to do all of the postseason stuff they would normally do in the regular season just to appear as though they are truly a contender. Now, like I said, anytime you have as much change as the Bucks have had with their roster and their coaching staff, it's going to take some time. And I would fully expect them to explore some options at the trade deadline in terms of adding some personnel defensively that's going to be able to help them. This could certainly be an Alex Caruso team. This could be a handful of wings around the league that can guard and can shoot a little bit. They can't go into the postseason relying on Malik Beasley and Jay Crowder as their perimeter wings. It's just not going to work. They don't have Drew Holiday anymore. They can't afford to have that level of wing depth and expect to get through the postseason. Now, yes, at some point they could try and use Giannis on some of these guys. They could try and use Giannis as a really big defender on some of the quicker guards. Obviously, Giannis could guard guys like Jason Tatum potentially in the postseason, but that's not something that Milwaukee has gone to a ton in the past. They like having Giannis as just a playmaker defensively and a little bit more of a roamer. And one, that's not something he has a ton of practice with. It makes sense in theory because of his physical profile, but two, that's something that's really taxing on a guy that offensively in Giannis already has to do a ton for you. And then to ask him to do even more could be detrimental to the team overall. And so basically where I land with Milwaukee right now is this. Their defense is a problem. And if they continue this way throughout the entire season, they are the contender or semi-contender amongst the teams that are currently viewed at the top of the league. They're the team that I trust the least, because every other team around the league that is seen as a contender, if they have issues, it's because of one injury or another, or just an off shooting night, or some things that they can adjust. Milwaukee is the only contender that I see right now that has a legitimate personnel issue. They don't have enough right now, at least in terms of their defense, to make a true championship run without adding a piece. And they certainly can add a piece, but even at that point, their defense is such a big problem that I don't know if they're just one trade deadline move away. And I know this sounds very dramatic for a team that has one of the best records in the league, that has one of the best offenses in the league. But when you look a little bit deeper at how they're getting to those numbers, their defense is having such a massive impact on how their season is going and could potentially continue to go.